Support for this episode comes from the University of San Francisco's SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, better known as JSSJ. The JSSJ graduate level certificate program in JEDI empowers professionals with invaluable skills, tools, and resources to connect generations and ensure inclusive growth. Courses this spring include Meet the Moment, Fighting Anti-Semitism and Building a Just World, and Dismantling Racism from the Inside Out. The JEDI plus JSSJ program is built around your busy schedule, driven by your individual professional development, and steeped in a rich culture rooted in justice. Learn more and apply now at usfca.edu/JEDI. Happy Hanukkah! This year, Judaism Unbound is partnering with our friends, the Torah Studio, in an initiative called ApocryFest, Hanukkah Unbound and Uncanonized. We believe that Hanukkah can be a time of year where we connect to many books that were not officially included in the Hebrew Bible, but which nonetheless can be meaningful for Jewish individuals, communities, and the world. Through 4 bonus episodes, we will be exploring some of these books in detail and asking big questions about what canon even means. Liana Wertman, founder of the Torah Studio, which is an accessible and inclusive learning space that encourages people to take ownership of our traditional Jewish texts, and to past partner with us on live streaming events exploring books from Esther to Lamentations to Ecclesiastes to Ruth, joins us for all 4 of these bonus conversations. Learn more and sign up for our ApocryFest email list, which will be sent out throughout Hanukkah, by visiting judaismunbound.com/apocrypha. That's APOCRYPHA. This is a special bonus edition of Judaism Unbound, ApocryFest 2024 number 2, Joseph and Aseneth. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Lex Rofberg.
And I'm Liana Wertman.
And it's time to continue our fest of Apocrypha, also known as ApocryFest. We are jazzed to be wandering our way through Hanukkah with all y'all out there. And we're doing so, as is our minhag, as is our custom, through looking at books that were not canonized in Jewish tradition, but which we ourselves can canonize to some degree, or at least that we can see as worth navigating for meaning. And so today we're gathered to do so through the prism of a book that I think is super interesting, called Joseph and Aseneth, alternately called Aseneth. We're starting with the title Joseph and Aseneth because the figure Joseph is more well known to people out there from the book of Genesis, and Aseneth, who is Osnat in Hebrew, is less well known. But she and he are married in the book of Genesis, and she is from Egypt. She is Egyptian. This book, Joseph and Aseneth, runs wild with learning more about this couple and how they met. It's a little bit rom-com-y, a little bit meet-cute, a little bit, I don't know. I'm picturing, like, who's starring in this? Liana, help me out. You're in LA. Who's
this is
cast?
absolutely Timothy Chalamet and Zendaya, right? Like
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so we're running back Dune. Oh, and we're even in the right area of the world. Yeah. This is Dune fanfic, or you know what? Dune is fanfic on Joseph and Aseneth, I believe. So y'all listening, send us your Dune connections. But we are going to experience the Timothy Chalamet-Zendaya combo that is Joseph and Aseneth. And so to start out, we're just going to talk a little bit about like what happens in this text. We know it's probably unfamiliar to most of you listening. We are putting some links in our show notes so that you can read about it, some like meta articles, and also so that you can just get the text of it. But Joseph and Aseneth, cool book. It is taking a crack at this moment in the Torah where Joseph is a fellow who has made his way to Egypt. He is, sold into slavery by his brothers. He ends up in Egypt and rises to power. And he encounters a woman named Aseneth. And so, Liana, can you take us a little bit into what happens here?
So, as you said, Joseph is in Egypt. He's rising to power. And one of the first things Pharaoh does is be like, settle yourself in, get a wife. And he is, for folks who don't remember, Jacob's son. He's one of the 12 sons of Jacob. He ends up being kind of the main character at the end of Genesis. And unsurprisingly to me, is portrayed in this book as incredibly pious and loving God, because that's kind of Joseph's shtick. He's like, God loves me, everything good happens to me. And he wants to find a wife. Aseneth is also a very pious person. She doesn't like to see men. I get that sometimes. She wants to hang out in her house. She's gorgeous. Everyone's in love with her. And meets Joseph, who usually she expects these men to kind of like freak out about her. And he's like, no, I need someone who loves God. And she is heartbroken. She's crushed. She's like, this is the love of my life. And she has this crazy experience where she essentially has this wild religious revelatory relationship with God come out to being, where she realizes what she wants to do with her life, how she processes all of her big emotions about love and about God. And she comes out and she's like, I'm ready to marry Joseph. I'm going to pass it over to you.
Amazing. And so Joseph and Aseneth do in fact end up together. And by the way, it's after, I mean, you talked about this like revelatory experience. She has this, you could call it a dream or like mystical experience. I think you could read it either way, just as people tend to do with all of those like God encounters or dream encounters, where she interacts with like an angel figure, and the angel looks exactly like Joseph. She basically takes from this, like, okay, Joseph is this really elevated kind of figure. She seems almost immediately to just be sold on, oh yeah, Joseph is from this group that seems to believe in this God Yud He Vav He, and like I'm kind of like, it sounds cool. Like
he's got Pharaoh's stamp of approval already.
Yeah, that's the other thing. Like throughout this story, all of the Egyptians involved seem very happy for Aseneth to like be with it. There's no concern like, wait, we have our Egyptian gods. You shouldn't be partnering with this guy who has this other god. Like they're all jazzed about it, like over the moon.
They're like, God loves this guy.
Right. And so that's in some ways where we leave off. Now there's two different versions of this story, and scholars yell at each other over which one they think is original and which came later. Like there's a short version and a long version, just like all of, your uncle's stories. The question is whether the original was like really long and it was edited down by somebody with a specific set of goals, or if the original was really short and it was then expanded by a particular somebody with a set of goals. We talked about this with the expanded Esther last year that's in Greek and how there's different agendas there. But suffice to say, there's a whole additional section where we encounter some brothers of Joseph who are super jealous and sort of upset that they have been cast aside. These are children of Zilpah and Bilhah, usually called maidservants, like I really like wives of Joseph that we tend to call something else. But like they were the parents of a few of the tribes, and a couple of them say what I always have wondered they might say in between the lines. Like, why is the fact of our parentage making us automatically less valuable than everybody else? Seems screwed up. And they say this, and they kind of partner with, if I remember right, it's the son of Pharaoh. The son of Pharaoh is upset because he was one of these suitors that wanted to marry Aseneth. And so he finds these brothers of Joseph. They team up to try and take down Joseph. They fail, partially because, remind me, like Levi has the ability to like see the future, or like,
yeah, someone can see the future and is like, brothers, I forgive you.
Levi is able to anticipate what's about to happen and convince the jealous brothers to not be so jealous.
Well, speaking of sorry to go back to last week's Judith section where we were talking about reviving brothers in this scenario, right? Levi here is given this ability to be forgiven for his past actions by being suddenly so prophetic. And on this other hand, we have these brothers who are underscored, who it is said in Genesis that Joseph was raised with them, right? That Zilpah and Bilhah were the ones, because Rachel died, who raised Joseph. So there's also a relationship of, you were one of us and now you think you're better than us. Like this power imbalance among Jacob's children, that Levi also has this like power that is going to let us know in the future. Sorry, I'm getting excited because this is why Apocrypha is so fun, because it, like you said, it asks the exact same questions that we are asking about Torah.
Yeah, that's the thing. We're not that new. We're not that creative. We think that we're super sophisticated and history has evolved from a place where people didn't think that sophisticatedly, and then now we in the 21st century ask all the questions of the text. No, like they were wondering the same things a lot of the time. I don't want to say they're identical to us.
But I
Maybe
would
we're
say,
worse in some ways, but
pretty clearly you don't need a cell phone to be upset by the idea that Zilpah and Bilhah's children are treated less equally in our tradition.
100%. And it's interesting because this comes in the context of a book where the general threads of like insider, outsider, even Joseph himself, like being from elsewhere, but then rising to power in a society that isn't his in Egypt. These threads of the empowered and the not empowered, the interaction between groups that are often treated as like diametrically opposed. I mean, remember, the primary story we have on the Torah side of Jews' experience in Egypt and departure from Egypt, exodus from Egypt, is one in which the Egyptians are pretty directly an enemy. They are not given a whole lot of sympathy. And I think one of the whys of this text might have been the author wanted to depict a positive relationship between Israelites or Judeans and their neighbors, and wanted to say it's not actually the case that like we have to be isolated as our own thing and the only way we can relate to those around us is through conflict. Because the people that are looking to conflict here are actually the bad folks. Like the son of Pharaoh and the brothers of Joseph are the problem, because without them, we'd actually all be getting along reasonably well in this story.
One thing that always catches me when I think about the Joseph story itself, and I think is really highlighted here in reverse, is that in the Joseph story, Joseph is so excited to be able to take on an Egyptian identity. He gets a new name, Zaphanath Paneah. He takes that name. It's one of the reasons why his brothers don't recognize him, is because he fully assumes an identity. And then he names his children Ephraim and Manasseh, meaning, thank God I don't remember my home being so awful, right? Like, it's like, he's like, go away. I'm running away from my home. I have this new identity. I'm deeply in relationship with my wife and my community. And I'm intrigued by this idea of also Asenath, right? That the relationship is almost mutual. He both becomes Zaphanath Paneah, but she also becomes almost an Israelite in relationship with him. In our last episode, we were talking about Achior being a model of someone joining into a religion. And I wonder how you're feeling about how Asenath in this experience kind of joins into the cause of the Jewish people and where those limits are that you see it.
I love it. So my answer to that question is that I am deeply, like all of us, I'm shaped by my own interests in how I read these stories. So in a lot of texts, we can include Ruth in this, the book of Ruth, there is like an ambiguous situation where we could read somebody as converting, but if we don't read them as converting, then we have an interfaith relationship that's happening. Because if they convert, then it's no longer interfaith. It's two people of the same tradition now. One just wasn't always. And I am myself in an interfaith relationship. And so my predisposition tends to be to see, like all of us, I think, to see myself in stories when I can. And so for me, the story of Joseph and Aseneth as somebody who is Jewish and somebody who isn't is like a more natural read. I think that somebody who converts to Judaism would probably, and is not also in an interfaith relationship, maybe we should talk to some folks who are both, but like they would probably see in this the stories that resonate around conversion. And it's not that either of us are right or wrong, but like I mostly haven't read it that way. I do think that it could be. I think that she clearly has like a shift in consciousness or a shift in her relationship to the world and to her family. I mean, what's so interesting is her personal relationship to Yud He Vav He, to God, or not to the Egyptian gods. Like I said, her family seems happy about it, or at least not unhappy. I'm not sure if she like shifts her ideology or if she just like adopts a new relationship to somebody who himself has a different world.
But she builds a relationship with the God that he has a relationship with, because you don't have to be the exact same to honor and respect the relationships your partner has that are important to them.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. We had an episode with Erwin Keller on the podcast not too long ago where he was talking about the Ruth and Naomi language. And we spoke about how you could read, your God will be my God, I will lodge where you will lodge. Like, you could read it as Ruth is like sacrificing her background. Like, I won't lodge where I lodge anymore, I'll lodge where you lodge. Or you could say, where you lodge, I will lodge. Like, we together will figure out where that is. Your God will be my God. That might actually be a different statement from the God you've been believing in, I now believe in the exact same way. It's more of a meeting point. And I think that's, if I hear you right, what you're getting at here, that there's not like a full discarding of who Aseneth is, but rather like a meeting potentially.
Exactly. And I think it's something that actually I talk to my students a lot when we study almost specifically how the Egyptians respond to Israelites in the Torah, because I like to remind us that this is 3,000 years ago. The Egyptians are polytheists. They believe in multiple gods. And I think often we forget, because we're monotheists and also people 3,000 years later, it's a lot easier, in my opinion, to imagine that Egyptians who are like, yeah, God, there are lots of gods. They have different relationships and different gods pick their like beings on earth who represent them. That Joseph is kind of like someone super powerful with a super powerful God they hadn't heard of. There's a respect of, honestly, like this is absolutely ahistorical, but there's religion.
New God just dropped. I gotta listen.
Yeah, exactly. Who knows? I don't have to follow that God to respect them. There's honestly a ahistorical religious appreciation and relationship here happening where they're like, we can live alongside each other. We can have these two different experiences alongside each other, and we can respect each other as people who care about the divine. Aseneth's parents are priests. Like, they are important religious figures. And I think that that's a piece of it, right? To not see that these important religious figures are upset that there's this other person who has a different God. They're like very grateful that someone who has a deep relationship to the divine is having a relationship that matters with their child.
Yeah, I love that. There's ways in which this story, I mean, we talked about this last week with Achior's conversion and how it's very just like matter of fact and not all that complicated to the text that he converts. And he's part of the crew and there's not a whole bunch of questions. Like, I think similarly, there's things that this text takes as like, okay, so they had their Egyptian gods, okay, and now they've got another. It's fine, and we don't have to, like, that's cool. Next.
Have fun, fall in love.
Yeah, like that's, yeah, by the way, I can't stop picturing Timothée Chalamet and Zendaya in my head. That's
it's the
now
perfect
like my
parent.
Yeah, I'm ready for the Hollywood adaptation of all the apocryphal books, but especially this one. I think this would be the first to get picked up. It's a rom-com. It's or a rom dramedy.
Intrigue, you know, there's like an assassination attempt, love story. It's gorgeous.
Yeah, it's a great pitch for anybody out there who's a film writer.
Everyone is explicitly described as super, super gorgeous and good looking. So it's perfect for Hollywood, right? Like it's actually part of the story that it's a Hollywood movie.
Yep. Oh, that is for sure. Yeah. And I don't know, I wanted to get into one final piece of this. It's probably going to end up linking to our next bonus episode. There's this moment where she encounters this angel in a dream or whatever, and that spurs her towards her connection to Joseph and their relationship. I noticed in the text, and I actually sent a note to a few of my Bible scholar or late antiquity friends to see if I was off my rocker and they're like, yeah, there's something there. I noticed that there's real parallels between that scene where Aseneth is encountering this angel figure. It's like really parallel to the burning bush. And so Aseneth actually, and remember, she's not an Israelite yet for sure, even if she sort of becomes one as you may read it. She, a non-Jew, for lack of a better term, or non-Israelite, has a burning bush experience with a messenger of God. And the reason why I say it's parallel, it literally says like, take off your garment at the burning bush. Moses is told, take off your shoes, you're on holy ground. Aseneth is told, like, take off, I think her tiara or something, like some garment. The angel is described as like fiery and full of light in a way very parallel to the actual burning bush that is fiery. There were like a few other parallels that came up. And I love that. I love that already in this point in time, the Bible was serving as a jumping off point for new kinds of stories. It feels like Midrash. Now, this isn't posing itself as Midrash. We talked about that last year. It's posing itself as like on equal footing with the original story, but it's kind of wild. And it's like a really learned text. It's not just coming out of somebody's butt. Like, they're finding really specific passages from Jewish tradition to incorporate. And the last thing I'll say is that my favorite thing about this book is actually not the content of it. It's that we have no idea scholars do not know when it was written. There's like a 500-year span of maybe 200 BCE all the way to maybe like the 300s CE. And that is a massive, I mean, imagine if we had a book where it's like, maybe Shakespeare wrote this, but also maybe it was written by a 21st century American literature author. Like that's what we're talking about here. It is so hard to pin down. It both resembles, and it also, we don't know whether it was written by somebody we might now term Christian, because if it's as late as the 300s, it certainly could have been. And then it could be a really interesting commentary even on the relationship between Jews and Christians in addition to the Egyptians. And we also don't know, it could have been written by a Judean during the time of like the Maccabees. It's hard to tell, and that allows us to really have a massive span of interpretations.
I think I'm also really struck whenever it comes to a text that is very aware of Torah, how much it proves why I think it's so important to study Torah, right? Not because it's more important than any of these books, though. I mean, we've had this argument and I do think they're more important, but that's just because not because they are by default, but just because we've made them more important. But it's how we know we're having the conversation together, right? If I was reading this text and they were like pulling stuff out of nowhere and I'd be like, okay, it's cool to imagine that Joseph had a relationship with this person that was more meaningful than just having children or being paired together by Pharaoh. And who wrote this and why? But when I find that it is deeply rooted in Torah, what it tells me is that this person wants me to be trusting them to be making these comparisons for a reason. That I can look at Joseph and Aseneth and say, oh, what questions in Torah, what gaps in Torah are they answering right now with this text? What do I get to learn from this? And what does this then teach me about Torah? And I think that I say this because I hope people, when they listen to this series, are like, well, I also have a lot of questions and I want to write or create ways to fill those questions in. And the more rooted it is in Torah, the more you might feel like they actually answer those questions, and the more the art in the end will answer those questions. And I feel like that's why we are so excited to talk about them at all, is because they so clearly answer our questions.
Amazing. I hope everybody reads this text. It's really, really wild. Again, in our show notes. The last thing I want to say, we didn't get to this. It's often the most commented part of the book because it's so out of left field and wild. This encounter with the angel Joseph God figure, Aseneth gets like fed honeycomb, and it seems to be this like allegorical thing. I'm not going to try to spin the precise meaning. Others totally can.
Honey from the crag, isn't that from Torah?
Oh, there you go. But it's a bizarre, fantastical story combined with rom-com, combined with clearly being from a couple thousand years ago. But I really think that a lot of us would be able to read it and find interesting new threads of meaning, both about this story itself and also how it affects our relationship to those other texts. I mean, the discarded sons of Zilpah and Bilhah, I really like that we might read that back into Genesis.
Yeah.
I think that that's an important right-sizing kind of act. But we will close on that set of notes, and we want to remind folks that we have our ApocryFest Havdalah. It's going to be this coming Saturday as we release this episode. It's December 28th. And it's at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. We'll be in Zoom. We hope that you'll come and share our bursting energy at Apocrypha. And we also hope that you'll just revisit our past episodes that we've released, that you'll send us your questions, your ideas, your visions for what we might do with these stories moving forward. You can be in touch with me at lex@judaismunbound.com and with Liana at Liana, Liana, at thetorastudio.org. So this has been a lovely deep dive into a story that I had no idea about until the last few years, and I hope that it opens things up for you. So with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.